Hey everyone, welcome back to theclinicaltrials.gov. Again, that website address is theclinicaltrials.gov. We do videos, written posts, interviews. Today's an interview with regular guest, Mr. Darshan Kulkarni. He is an attorney who specializes in clinical trials. Notice I didn't say FDA lawyer this time.
Focuses. I'm not allowed to say specializes.
Oh, not even specially. You focus on clinical trials.
It's a legal thing.
Very good. Well, regardless, he's very knowledgeable on the stuff, and he's got a lot of information for you guys. And today we're going to be talking about clinicaltrials.gov and how you, as a study participant or someone interested in joining a study, can utilize clinicaltrials.gov. And so, Darshan, why don't you talk about your recent talk that you gave or presentation?
Sure. So, I presented a few weeks ago. Well, actually, maybe a few days ago, actually, at something called the Inspection Summit. And the Inspection Summit was a talk where we landed up talking about the different issues that come in the area of FDA inspections, primarily FDA inspections. I presented on two different topics. One was the anti-kickback and all that kind of stuff. The second one was we did a panel discussion on clinicaltrials.gov and if there are any enforcement actions, what is clinicaltrials.gov, what are the interest levels, and had those discussions along with it. We had three participants. We had me, who was representing the law firm, the Kulkarni law firm. There, we had Jean Marie Markham, who she's the CEO of her own CRO called ClinLogix, and we had Scott Cunningham, and he is, I believe, a partner at I can't remember the name of the law firm. It's a huge law firm, and I apologize, Scott. I'm sure we could get you that information if you reach out to me. I don't want to say the wrong name and guess. Basically, the topic was we had all of these regulatory affairs people in the room, and we were talking about clinicaltrials.gov. We were discussing what it is. And Dan and I were talking now, and we were talking on how, yes, there's an interest in the pharmaceutical industry knowing about it, but the patients need to know more about it. And so that's what gave the impetus for this talk. And let me start by just describing what clinicaltrials.gov is, and Dan, you can sort of take it from there, if you will. Clinicaltrials.gov is a website that is dedicated to ensuring that clinical trials information for most, and I use that qualifiedly, most clinical trials is available for people. So it came out of two different sets of laws, but starting a few years ago, every clinical trial that's done that is, for the most part, connected to the United States, and I use the word connected to very generally, because we're trying, again, this is aimed at study patients, so I don't want to talk about the law, I don't want to talk about the regulations, but what I want to talk about is what the impact is. But any study that's out there where they use patients and it's being done for experimental reasons outside phase 1 studies, that information is available for study subjects. And that information can be sliced and diced in different ways. You can find out who's the principal investigator. You can find out if a study closed, what were the results of the study. You can find out who's enrolling right now. You can find out what the study design is. And there are certain requirements as to how soon that information must be publicized and what information can be kept confidential versus the information that has to be disclosed.
And you can also generally find out who to contact if you want to join the study. I say
Right.
generally. Normally they have a number, like a 1-800 number. Sometimes they'll have even more specific numbers, like individuals of people you can contact. And so I've directed a lot of, because I get emails like almost daily from people interested in joining studies, and it seems like they don't know they've never even heard of clinicaltrials.gov. And so, they asked me to find studies for them, and it literally takes me a minute or two. And I send them back results, and they think I'm amazing. Like, they think I'm connected to everybody in the industry. I'm not. All I'm doing is going to clinicaltrials.gov, and I'm typing in what they told me they'd like to participate in, like if they have breast cancer, if they have asthma, and then the area they're in. And I put submit, and I say hide studies that are not seeking volunteers.
Right.
So then you get only the enrolling studies or studies about to be enrolling.
Right.
And it's very simple. I mean, do you know any of the people from the actual clinicaltrials.gov, like the people who run that site? Have you met any of these people, or?
I haven't had to meet the people yet, and the big reason for it now is because as of earlier this week, well, maybe not this week, earlier last week, the FDA. So what used to happen was that NIH used to run clinicaltrials.gov, the National Institutes of Health. That's who used to be the people who used to run clinicaltrials.gov. Health and Human Services, who's sort of a parent organization, if you will, they came out and said, we want the FDA to start running it now. Because the FDA has enforcement powers, the FDA can sort of make sure certain things are happening. So starting last week, you're going to see a changeover in who is running clinical trials. We don't know yet who that will be, because the FDA is itself a pretty huge organization. So we don't have details yet on which specific area in the FDA will be doing it. But there is a change in ownership, if you will.
Really? And this is recent?
This is within the last week.
This could be breaking news that I'm going to be reporting on there, Sean. You probably did not hear it here first, but maybe you did. So is this common knowledge? Like, is it out there?
When you say out there, it was disclosed late last week.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Within the last, I mean, if you don't count the weekend, probably 2 to 3 days ago.
So okay, NIH is still running it, but as of last week,
FDA is going to be taking primary ownership, it seems.
From NIH.
Correct.
Ah. And I know NIH recently did some changes to their own website.
Is that right? I didn't.
I believe so. Yeah, they added a bunch of videos, like what is a clinical trial, and then they have those kind of videos on there. So maybe the transition was occurring months ago.
Maybe, and that's quite possible. In fact, there were a couple of discussions. The other thing to know is that at the inspection summit, we spoke to someone from CDRH, which is the area of the FDA that does device kind of stuff, and they informed us that they are still training people on what clinicaltrials.gov is. Now, to be fair, at this moment, they hadn't announced this changeover from NIH to FDA. So I don't know yet what the training is about. Was the training about how to enforce, or was the training about what is clinicaltrials.gov? So those are obviously two different things, because just so everyone knows, because there's a lot of conspiracy theorists out there who say that pharma tries to keep data within their own hands. With clinicaltrials.gov, they're required to report that data. And if they don't, there's a penalty of up to $10,000 per day for failure or appropriately. So those fines add up very, very quickly. The other thing to realize is that with clinicaltrials.gov, you have access to not just that website, but you actually have you heard of Lilly's COI plan? I don't know what they actually call it, but have you seen them?
I interact with some of the Lilly people on Twitter. They have like their own portal now.
Yeah. So they take clinicaltrials.gov and they let you splice and dice it in more ways.
Yes.
So, which is pretty useful for people who are looking for, I don't want to say more user friendly, but different ways to access the.
Yeah, and there's actually a lot of people doing that. If you go to the clinicaltrialsguru.com and you push search clinical trials, we're using the ClisMap app, which was given to us by a friend of the show, Sarkis Dalakian, and he created this. Basically, he just uses the API from clinicaltrials.gov, but presents it in a nicer way with maps and things like that. It looks a lot like Google Maps mixed with clinicaltrials.gov.
Interesting.
So it's just a nicer way to present it. But yeah, there are lots of people doing that. Now, for a study participant, Darshan,
Hmm?
why would it be important or usable for someone to want to see the data from prior clinical trials? How can that be helpful for if I'm a study participant?
Well, quite simply, one of the big goals of a study participant is to advance medical science. But one of the things as an individual you want to be sure of is that you don't hurt yourself to the extent possible. Um, so what, or at least if you do hurt yourself, you knew what you were getting into before that happens to you.
Mm.
Um, what clinicaltrials.gov lets you see is what were the prior studies done, and therefore you can look at what were the adverse events other study participants suffered from.
Ah.
So by looking at what those adverse events were, they might a potential subject may say, "I don't want to be part of this study because I don't think that I can take the risks and the benefits associated with this. The risks outweigh the benefits for me." On the other hand, other participants may say, "You know what? I'm seeing this. It's a cancer study. I'm willing to take those risks because the benefits for me far outweigh the risks." So you can start looking at efficacy data. You can start looking at adverse event data, you can start looking at, do I trust the types of doctors that these people have worked with before, or is this sort of a seeding trial?
Mm.
And for those of you who don't know what seeding trials typically are just marketing trials. So you can take a look at what is the study design and decide, is this a type of study I want to participate in, or are people doing this for marketing reasons? And hopefully that doesn't happen too often, but to be fair, in the interest of full disclosure, that happens, and that's not something the industry is proud of. Um, but as a study participant, you should go look, and this is sort of doing homework. You do homework to study on things. Why not do homework on something that could dramatically affect your life? Go and find out what information is out there available to you. I can tell you that as healthcare practitioners, more and more healthcare practitioners go online to clinicaltrials.gov to evaluate what treatment is appropriate for certain things. And you can just do a quick search on clinicaltrials.gov and see what previous study results were. Can they trust those study results? So we often, as healthcare practitioners, use databases like Micromedics or use databases like Lexicomp or UpToDate, but those databases are updated only so often.
Mm-hmm.
Clinicaltrials.gov is often faster than these other databases. So patients and subjects can use that data as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and people forget there's like 20 million Americans every year that participate in clinical trials, and very few use clinicaltrials.gov. At least from my experiences, there's a lot of people just trusting their doctors, which is
Mm-hmm.
fine, and there's a lot of people just getting enrolled randomly, by different means. But if you really want to do your homework and be what they call an e-patient, right? Is that the term they use?
Empowered. Yep.
Empowered and also electric, right?
I haven't seen the electric. I've seen the empowered.
Empowered and engaged, I guess. That's the
There you
hot
go.
term is e-patient. But
Mm-hmm.
seriously, just go to clinicaltrials.gov. Not only can you see what trials are available, but you can read up on previous trials using those drugs to see if you're okay with the possible adverse events,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Anything else for the trial participants or future hopeful trial participants as far as clinicaltrials.gov?
Um, yeah, the big thing to realize is know that so there's a big problem out there, and the big problem is that depending on who you look at and what numbers to look at, not every study gets registered. Um, there was some information out there that said that only 20 to 25% of all studies get registered. So we talked about the $10,000 fines per day, and on the other hand, you talk about only 20 to 25% of studies get registered. Um, the reason for that often is pharmaceutical companies will make mistakes, but pharmaceutical companies, for the most part, are aware of these issues. They have the right databases and controls in place to address that, especially the larger ones. The smaller ones sometimes don't have the resources, may not know about this. The CROs may not be aware of these. But a lot of these problems often come from academic medical centers who are doing small samples. And where they're sort of saying, "Oh, I don't need to register this on clinicaltrials.gov. It's not a study that I think needs to be registered." So you should be aware that, and as a participant, you may want to ask, "Why is the study not being registered? Why couldn't I find it on clinicaltrials.gov?" So if you are a true empowered patient, that may be part of what you discuss with your physician. And I've spoken to physicians, and a lot of them sort of say, "Well, I don't think we need to." Why don't you need to? They may not know that they have a potential $10,000 fine, and that's part of why I would postulate, and I have no reason to believe that this is true, but I think enforcement may be a huge reason why there is a transfer of ownership from NIH to FDA.
That's probably the reason why. We can speculate.
It's pure speculation.
Right, but it's probably correct.
I will try not to comment on that.
Don't comment, but we understand. Now, there is a problem because, yes, when I've used clinicaltrials.gov for business development purposes, and we'll do another video on this right now. It's true. A lot of the studies that we were doing, were never reported by the sponsor. And I always wondered why. And it seemed like more often than not, they were not reported.
Right, but now you know, because it's often the smaller sponsors. I don't know what type of studies you do, Dan, but...
No, they were big sponsors, And
really?
Yes, and the thing is that the studies that I would find, and we'll get into this in the next video, were, in fact, the academic centers, which...
Really?
I, as a business person, had no use for, because they're only doing the study at one place. So I would get annoyed, personally.
Okay.
And I always wondered why. I thought every trial is supposed to be registered. So hopefully with the FDA taking over, this can be done.
So let me help you qualify. Now, I don't want to get into the details and the nitty-gritty. But, for example, Phase 1 studies don't need to be registered.
Okay.
Phase 2 through 4 have to be registered as long as they basically have something to do with the US FDA. So if you're doing a study in China where... and they are never going to submit an IND. And I was trying to avoid using words like IND, but let's say you're doing a study in China where they're never going to try to get into the US. You don't need to register that study. But if you're doing a study in China with the idea that I might go on later on and get an IND submitted, that study may need to be registered. And you probably should start talking to people to make sure that that happens, because there are some, we've talked about financial penalties, but the FDA may theoretically say, I'm not going to accept this study. And you want to be careful about those things. So,
that would be a problem, for a lot of these drug companies out there. I'm sure they know what they're doing. So,
yes.
And I'm sure they're just doing it to keep what they consider their own data away from other sponsors because they're fiercely competitive. Right?
Mm-hmm. Correct.
Yeah, so anyways, this wraps up this video for the study participants. It's called How Can I Use clinicaltrials.gov to Find a Study to Participate in. Hopefully this helps. This is Dan and Darshan Kulkarni from theclinicaltrialsguru.com. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.